The city of Chicago has a heartbeat you can feel if you press your ear to the right wall. Not the tourist Chicago, not the lakefront joggers or the deep dish pizza places on Michigan Avenue, but the other Chicago. The one that breathes beneath the surface, in basement offices and late-night parking structures and whispered phone calls that go dead before you can trace them. That Chicago has a pulse like a war drum. Steady. Relentless. Dangerous. I learned to hear it because of Daniel. My brother was 3 years older than me, with the same pale complexion that made people ask if we were sick, the same sharp red lips that our mother used to call our greatest inheritance, and a laugh that could fill a room so completely there was no space left for silence. He was a journalist before I was. He was everything before I was. I followed him into every room, every career, every bad idea he ever had, and I would follow him into this one too, except Daniel walked into this particular room and never walked out. The call came on a Tuesday in October. I was in my apartment on the north side eating cereal at 11:30 at night because I'd forgotten to eat dinner again, scrolling through a draft article on city council embezzlement that my editor called too aggressive, and I called not aggressive enough. My phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize, which I normally ignore. Something made me answer. Mason Reed? A woman's voice. Formal. The kind of formal that comes from practicing how to deliver bad news. Yes. This is Detective Angela Mars from Chicago PD. I'm calling regarding Daniel Reed. The cereal spoon hit the counter. I didn't remember putting it down. There was an incident tonight at the Lakeview parking structure on Belmont. Your brother, we believe it was an accident. He fell from the 4th level. Mason, I'm very sorry to tell you that Daniel Reed was pronounced dead at Northwestern Memorial at 9:47 this evening. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because my legs gave out, though they might have. I sat down because standing felt obscene, like standing was something people did when the world still made sense. He fell, I said. That's what we believe at this time. Daniel was afraid of heights. He wouldn't go near a parking structure. Pause. Very brief. The kind of pause that is not really a pause but a decision. We'll be conducting a full investigation. We'd like you to come in tomorrow. I came in tomorrow. And the day after. And the week after that. And with each visit, the investigation grew colder, the answers grew vaguer, and the single file folder that held the evidence of my brother's last week's alive grew thinner rather than thicker, which is the opposite of how investigations are supposed to work. What I found in his apartment told me everything the police refused to. Daniel had been working a story. Not just any story, the kind of story that gets journalists killed in other countries and, apparently, in parking structures in Lakeview. He'd spent 8 months building a dossier on financial flows between Chicago's construction industry, 3 city aldermen, and a federal infrastructure grant program worth $2.3 billion. The grant was supposed to rebuild the South Side. Instead, it was being funneled through shell companies into private accounts, and the money trail, if followed correctly, led directly to the campaign finance network of Illinois' fastest-rising political star, Senator Colton Hayes. I sat on Daniel's bed surrounded by his notes. Printed files, handwritten margins, sticky notes in his cramped scrawl, and I understood 2 things simultaneously. My brother had been murdered, and I was going to finish what he started. I spent 3 weeks doing what Daniel had already done, covering his tracks so I understood his methodology, and then I spent another 3 weeks going further. By December I had confirmed what he'd found and added layers he hadn't reached yet. The corruption was worse than Daniel knew. The network was larger, the figures more powerful, and the man at the center of it, Colton Hayes, was not the kind of opponent you walked up to with a recorder and a press badge. He was 34, the youngest senator Illinois had sent to Washington in 2 decades. He'd grown up in Bridgeport, South Side, working class, the kind of biography that played beautifully in campaign ads, and built a political career on infrastructure, economic development, and a rhetoric of accountability that was apparently very good at hiding the opposite of accountability underneath it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that photographers loved and a jawline that had graced the cover of Chicago magazine twice. He had a reputation for being brilliant and ruthless in equal measure, and the people who worked for him either loved him with a fervor that bordered on cult-like devotion, or feared him with the specific fear of those who have seen exactly what he's capable of. My editor told me I was too close to the story. Conflict of interest. Grief distorting my judgment. He offered me bereavement leave. I took the leave and used it to plan my infiltration. The strategy was not elegant, but it was the only one that made sense. Colton Hayes was careful. He never communicated anything incriminating by phone or email. His meetings were in person, in private, in controlled environments where only his most trusted inner circle was permitted. The paper trail that Daniel had found was real but circumstantial. Enough to raise questions, not enough to break a story that would survive the inevitable legal assault of a senator's legal team. To get what I needed, I had to get inside. And to get inside, I had to become the kind of person Colton Hayes would choose to let in. I was told, often and with a frankness that felt more clinical than complimentary, that I was handsome. Delicately so, the kind of looks that made people look twice and then look away slightly embarrassed as though they'd been caught thinking something. The pale skin, the red mouth, the fine bone structure of my face that people called striking, when they were being generous, and almost feminine, when they weren't. I had learned early to use it and hate using it in equal measure. For Daniel, I would use it without apology. The entry point was a fundraiser, a January gala at the Langham, black tie, for the Illinois Infrastructure Development Coalition, which was one of the organizations at the center of Daniel's dossier. Press credentials for a publication called the Policy Review, a legitimate enough outlet that my editor friend had connections to, got me a press lanyard and a glass of champagne and a room full of people who were all, in some degree, complicit in something. I saw Hayes across the room before he saw me. He was doing what politicians do at these events. The controlled orbit, moving from cluster to cluster, shaking hands and holding eye contact a beat too long and laughing at the precise moment to make the laugher feel seen. He was good at it. Effortlessly good, which was more dangerous than visible effort. When his eyes found me, I was ready. I didn't approach. I let the pull work in the direction it needed to, which meant I simply stood where I was, held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register, short enough to seem unintentional, and then looked away with deliberate slowness. 20 minutes later, a man in a gray suit materialized at my elbow. Before we dive into this twisted, reborn, revenge and redemption, emotional love story, if you are obsessed with reborn and revenge stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and also comment on the story, and don't forget this story is an original work of MeBL Stories, no copyrights. If you see this story in another channel, please report that channel for copyright and theft. Now let's dive in. Senator Hayes would like to be introduced, he said, which was the most political way I'd ever heard anyone phrase "my boss thinks you're attractive." Then introduce us, I said. His name was Marcus, the aide, and he led me across the room with the practiced invisible efficiency of someone who managed these moments regularly. When I reached Hayes, I had to adjust my expectations because the thing about photographs is that they flatten. In person, Colton Hayes had a weight to him that cameras couldn't quite capture. Not physical weight, though he was tall and solid in the way of someone who took his body seriously, but a kind of gravitational density that made the air around him feel slightly more substantial. Dark eyes that processed everything they landed on. A mouth set in a line that suggested it knew what it wanted to say and was deciding whether to say it. Mason Reed, Marcus said. Policy Review. Senator, I said and shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief. The grip of someone who had shaken 10,000 hands and learned that the handshake is a statement, not a greeting. Policy Review, he repeated. You cover infrastructure? Among other things. He held my gaze with the same quality I'd identified from across the room, slightly too long, slightly too direct. What other things? Whatever story is worth telling, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion, not yet, but interest. The engaged, calibrated interest of a man who was used to people wanting something from him and had learned to measure what kind of want it was. We should talk, he said. We are talking, I pointed out. His mouth curved. Just slightly. I mean properly. I let 3 seconds pass before I nodded, as though I was considering whether to agree, as though my entire plan hadn't hinged on exactly this moment. All right, I said. Properly. Getting close to Colton Hayes was like being allowed into a sealed room. Once you were in, everything looked different from the inside. His world operated on layers. The public layer was the senator, the speechmaker, the face in the press conferences. Below that was the professional layer, the staff, the strategy meetings, the war rooms where campaigns were won and legislation was drafted. Below that was the private layer, which was where things actually happened, and which almost no one ever saw. He brought me into the professional layer first. An interview request, formally arranged at his Chicago office in a building on LaSalle Street whose lobby alone communicated 3 things. Money, power, and the kind of permanence that neither expected nor required anyone's approval. His communications director, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire who didn't like me on sight with the instinct of someone who recognized a threat before she could articulate why, scheduled me for 45 minutes. He gave me 2 hours. We talked about infrastructure. Genuinely talked about it, which surprised me because I'd expected performance and instead got analysis. He knew the details of every project in his portfolio with the specificity of someone who had not outsourced the understanding. He argued positions I disagreed with and he argued them well, and when I pushed back he didn't retreat to talking points, he engaged, and there were moments when the engagement felt so real and the thinking so sharp that I had to remind myself what I was sitting across from. A man who had my brother killed. The reminder steadied me. When the interview ended and I was gathering my things, he said, without looking up from the document he'd picked up, "There's a dinner Friday. Small. Some people you'd find interesting. If you want to come." I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of people?" "The kind that make things happen," he said, and finally looked up, and the directness of it landed somewhere low in my chest that I immediately refused to acknowledge. "Unless that's not your kind of story." "It's exactly my kind of story," I said. I went to the dinner. And the one after that. And the private gallery opening that was less about art and more about the quiet conversations happening in corners between men in expensive suits. I was careful to be useful enough to keep being invited, careful to ask questions that sounded like curiosity rather than investigation, careful to let him see exactly the version of me that would make him want to keep me close. What I was less careful about was the version of me that was real. Because there were moments, dinner conversations that ran past midnight, whiskeys in his office after everyone else had gone home, the car rides back across the city when Chicago was dark and fast outside the windows, when I forgot the architecture of my performance and something more honest came out, and I hated that something honest was coming out, and I hated more that he noticed when it did. "You're not actually interested in infrastructure," he said one night, 3 weeks in. We were in the back of his car, heading north, and the city was lit up in the way that makes Chicago look like it's made of fire at night. My pulse spiked, then steadied. "I'm interested in what infrastructure reveals about power," I said. "Where money flows. Who decides. That's not the same thing." "No. It's more interesting than the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. The profile of his face in city light was, I noted it and set it aside, severe and clean and unfairly beautiful in the way of things that don't know or care that they're beautiful. "What happened to your brother?" he said. The air left my lungs. I turned to look at him. He was still looking out the window. The question had been asked quietly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd asked it like an accusation. "How do you know about Daniel?" My voice came out level. I was proud of that. "I'm a politician in Chicago," he said. "I know things." He finally turned to look at me, and the darkness of his eyes at close range was something I had no defense against that I hadn't already deployed. "He was investigating something." "He died," I said. "In a parking structure." "Yes." He held my gaze. "I know." The car stopped at my building. I got out. At the door I turned back to look at him, still visible through the window watching me. His expression was unreadable in the way of men who have made an art form of unreadability. I went upstairs and sat on my bed and did not sleep for a long time. He called me the next morning. Not a text, not an email through Claire. His actual voice, his actual number, which he had not given me before and I had not asked for. "Breakfast," he said when I answered. Not a question. "It's 7 in the morning," I said. "I know. I've been up since 5. There's a place on the river. Meet me in an hour." The place was small and plain and the kind of restaurant that becomes a regular's restaurant because it doesn't try to impress anyone. He was already there when I arrived, in a booth in the back, no aide, no driver visible, coffee already in front of him, reading something on his phone that he put away when I sat down. "I want to tell you something," he said as greeting. "All right. What happened to your brother? I know what it looks like. I know what the story looks like from where you're sitting." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Large hands. I'd noticed that before and kept noticing it despite considerable effort not to. "I also know that. You've been inside my world for 3 weeks looking for evidence that I was involved in it." The floor of my stomach dropped. I kept my face still and said, "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," he said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. A tiredness, a weight that felt less like performance and more like the thing that performance was built to conceal. "It's a statement of fact and I'm not angry about it. If someone had killed my brother and the evidence pointed at me, I'd have been inside my world in 2 days, not 3 weeks. Silence. The restaurant hummed around us. "If you know why I'm here," I said slowly, "why are you still letting me in?" He looked at me with the kind of directness that bypasses every social intermediary and lands somewhere uncomfortably close to the bone. "Because you're good," he said. "And because you're wrong. And because I need someone with your particular combination of skills and motivation who isn't already bought." "I'm not for sale," I said. "I know." Pause. "That's why I need you." I sat with that. Outside, the river was gray and moving in the way it moves in January, heavy and purposeful. "Tell me," I said. And he did. What Colton Hayes told me over 2 hours of cold coffee and untouched eggs was not a confession. It was the opposite of a confession. He laid out, methodically and precisely and with the detailed recall of a man who had been living inside this thing for 2 years, the architecture of a corruption network that was both larger and different than anything Daniel or I had mapped. The shell companies were real. The money was real. But the source wasn't Hayes's campaign. The money was moving through structures adjacent to him, entities he'd been affiliated with, organizations that had endorsed him, without his knowledge or, more precisely, without his full knowledge because there were people in his circle who had been very careful to keep their activities just visible enough to implicate him if the story broke. Because a broken story that implicated a rising senator was far more valuable to the people running the network than a clean investigation. They needed a fall guy. They'd built one carefully over 4 years. Daniel found the trail, Hayes said. But he found the trail they wanted him to find. Daniel was good, I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended. He was excellent, Hayes said, and there was something in his voice that I couldn't immediately categorize but that I would spend a lot of subsequent time thinking about. That's why they couldn't let him finish. Who is they? He met my eyes. That's what I need you to help me find out. The conversation shifted something. Not in the story. The story was the story and I was still the journalist and he was still the subject and the chessboard had simply revealed a new configuration. But something shifted in the space between us, some barometric pressure change that I felt in my chest and my palms and the specific awareness I now had of the distance across the table between his hands and mine. I ignored it. I was good at ignoring things. I want everything, I said. Every file, every record, every person you suspect. If you're telling me the truth, transparency is your only leverage. Agreed, he said without hesitation. And I want access I haven't had yet. The inner circle. The private meetings. He studied me for a moment. The morning light through the window caught the edge of his jaw, the dark of his eyes, the set of a mouth that looked like it had things to say that it had decided not to say. That requires trust, he said. Then we'll have to build it, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Subtle, swift, a door opening and closing almost too fast to catch. I suppose we will, he said. Trust, I discovered, was built in the spaces between the work. The work itself was intense. Files reviewed in his office late into the night, cross-referencing Daniel's research against Hayes's own documentation, mapping the network, identifying the players, finding the threads that would, pulled correctly, unravel it. We were good together in that work, which was both useful and inconvenient, because being good at something with someone creates its own kind of intimacy, independent of intention. He was methodical where I was instinctive. I was willing to follow a thread into ambiguous territory where he was inclined toward confirmation before movement. When we disagreed, we argued, the kind of arguing where both people are actually listening to each other, which is rarer than it should be and which I had not done with anyone since Daniel, who argued exactly the same way. I didn't tell Hayes that. I kept that parallel behind a door I kept firmly shut. The spaces between the work were harder. There was a night in mid-January when we'd been in his office until after midnight, and the last aide had gone home, and we were at the long conference table with files spread between us, and the building was quiet in the way that large buildings get quiet when everyone has left. An amplified quiet, the kind that makes small sounds echo. He got up to pour whiskey from the cabinet by the window. He poured 2 glasses without asking. He set one in front of me and remained standing, looking out at the city, and I watched him from the table with the specific concentration of someone who is trying very hard not to have the thought they are having. Do you ever feel like you're living in a story someone else is writing? He said to the window. Every day for the last 3 months, I said. He turned around, leaned against the credenza. In the low light of the office lamps, with his jacket off and his shirt sleeves pushed up and his expression down from the controlled register it held in public to something more unguarded, he looked like a different person. Not a senator. Just a man. A very tired man who was carrying something enormous and had been carrying it alone. Why do you do it? He said. Journalism. The specific kind you do. I thought about the honest answer before giving the safe one and then gave the honest one because it had been that kind of night. Because someone has to follow the trail that other people want to go cold, I said. Because power without accountability is just violence with better lighting. He looked at me for a long moment. Daniel used to say something similar. My chest tightened. You knew him? More than just, you actually knew him. He approached me 6 months before he died, Hayes said. Off the record. He was suspicious of me, rightfully, and he came to me directly, which I respected. We had 2 conversations. I didn't give him enough. I was protecting sources, I was moving carefully, I made the wrong call about timing. He paused. His voice had changed. Gone quieter. I've thought about that every day since. He's still dead, I said. The words came out without softness and I didn't try to cushion them. Yes, he said. He is. And that's on me, at least in part. And I will spend whatever it takes to make sure the people who ordered it pay for it. That's not rhetoric, Mason. That's a promise. My name in his mouth did something to the temperature of the room. He'd said it before, we were past formalities by this point, but this was different. This was the version of my name that was said when someone wants to make sure you know they're looking at you and not around you. I picked up the whiskey glass. Then let's make sure the promise is worth making, I said. He sat down across from me. Closer than necessary because the files had shifted during the conversation and neither of us had moved them back to their professional distribution. Close enough that I could see the precise line of tiredness at the corners of his eyes, the small imperfection in the line of his lower lip where there was a faint scar I'd never noticed before. You're not afraid of me, he said. It sounded almost like a question. Should I be? Most people are. I know. I held his gaze. I'm not most people. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was charged, the way the air charges before a storm, not threatening exactly but full of a potential energy that knows where it wants to go. He didn't move. I didn't move. The city outside the window poured its light over us both. You should go home, he said eventually. His voice was lower than it had been. It's late. You're right, I said. Neither of us moved for another 10 seconds. Then he stood up and the moment broke the way they break. Not snapping, just releasing like a breath held too long. He got my coat from the hanger and held it out, which was such an unexpectedly old-fashioned thing to do that it startled a genuine smile out of me, brief and involuntary, and when I glanced back pulling the coat on I found him watching that smile with an expression that he had almost managed to clear from his face but not quite. In the elevator going down, alone, I pressed my back against the wall and stared at the ceiling and said out loud to no one, "Do not do this, Mason." The elevator arrived at the lobby. I did not listen to myself. It began the way it was always going to begin, gradually and then all at once, which is how every inevitable thing happens despite every intention to the contrary. We had been working together for 6 weeks. The investigation had developed new legs. I'd found a financial consultant named Patrick Webb whose name appeared in 3 separate shell company registrations, and Hayes had confirmed Webb was connected to a city alderman named Garrett Bloom, who had the kind of political relationship with the real power brokers that made him either a useful pawn or a dangerous operator, and we were narrowing in on something. I could feel it the way you feel a story approaching its breaking point, a tightening, a gathering of threats. It was a Saturday evening. We were in his private apartment. He had 2 residences in Chicago, the official one for political purposes and a smaller apartment in the West Loop that almost no one knew about, because the office felt too exposed for what we were discussing. The apartment was spare and clean and unexpectedly personal in small ways, books in untidy stacks, a coffee maker that was nicer than everything else, a jacket thrown over the back of a chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent but existed in the apartment the way only things people actually live with exist. We'd been working for 4 hours. The takeout containers were pushed to one corner of the coffee table. His reading glasses, which I had not known he wore and which produced a reaction in my chest I was deeply embarrassed by, were pushed up into his hair. My laptop was open beside his, the screens reflected in the dark window overlooking the street. I found the email at 9:47 in the evening. Colton. Something in my voice brought him across the room in a few steps. He leaned over my shoulder to read, and the proximity of him, the warmth of him, the particular gravity of his presence at close range, was something I processed in the background while the foreground processed what was on the screen. The email was from Daniel's recovered hard drive, in an encrypted folder I'd only just broken the key for. It was dated 2 weeks before Daniel died. It was addressed to Alderman Garrett Bloom. And it was from a name I recognized because I had seen it in Hayes' files. A name that was not Colton Hayes but was the person I suspected had used Hayes as a strategic blind. Theodore Marsh. Developer. 40-year political donor. The kind of man whose name appears on buildings and foundations and endowments but never in the news. The email was a threat. Daniel had found something, not the full picture but enough, and had sent it to Bloom as a warning shot. A mistake strategically. Daniel was brave before he was cautious. 2 weeks later he was dead. It's Marsh, I said. My voice was perfectly flat. I'd had the feeling building for a week but the confirmation was different. The confirmation had weight. Yes, Hayes said. I turned to look up at him. He was still close enough that the turn brought our faces within a breath of each other, and I saw the moment he registered that proximity and didn't step back from it. You knew it was Marsh, I said. I suspected. I couldn't prove it. You let me walk into this thinking it was you, I said, and you knew the whole time? I didn't know what you would find, he said. And yes, I let you in thinking I was the villain because the best investigative journalists are the ones who come in with the right anger. Your anger was correct. It was just aimed wrong. I should have been furious. I was furious, a clean, clarifying rage that I held like a compass for about 4 seconds before it was complicated by everything else I was also feeling, which was not clean and was not clarifying. He straightened up, moved to the window, stood with his back to me for a moment. I'm sorry about Daniel, he said to the glass. I'm sorry I didn't move faster. I'm sorry I was careful when I should have been immediate. I will be sorry about that for the rest of my life. I got up from the couch, crossed the room. I didn't know what I was going to do until I was standing behind him, and then I put my hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, flat-palmed, the way you touch someone when words are insufficient, and felt the breath go through him. He turned around. The look on his face was one I hadn't seen before. Not the senator. Not the strategist. Not even the tired man in the office with the whiskey. This was something stripped of all the layers, and it was the most dangerous thing I had encountered in this entire investigation, including the very real possibility that Theodore Marsh's people knew I was getting close. Mason, he said, and my name in his mouth was different from every other time he'd said it. I know, I said. This is not. I know, I said again, and I kissed him. I had kissed people before with intention and purpose and the awareness that I was doing it for a reason, and I had kissed people before with the carelessness of someone who wanted warmth and wasn't particular about the source. This was neither. This was the kind of kiss that happens when everything you've been not doing for 6 weeks finally overrides the infrastructure you built to prevent it, and the release of that, the sheer physical relief of finally closing the distance that you've been maintaining through effort, comes out in the pressure of it. He kissed me back. Not tentatively. Not as surprise recovered into performance. He kissed me back the way I was beginning to understand Colton Hayes did everything, with his whole attention, with his hands coming up to find the sides of my face with a deliberateness that turned my thinking to static, with a thoroughness that said I have been thinking about this in a language that required no translation. This complicates things, he said. Everything about this was already complicated, I said. A sound came out of him that was almost a laugh, low and not quite formed and warmer than anything I'd heard from him before. He pulled back enough to look at me properly. In the lamplight his eyes were very dark and very direct, and the expression in them was one I was going to spend a considerable amount of time afterward trying to describe and never quite succeeding. I need you to hear something, he said. And I need you to understand it as fact and not as strategy. All right. I am not using you. His voice was very even. Not the investigation, not tonight, not any of it. I am aware of how that sounds given the circumstances, and I am asking you to take it as true anyway. I studied him for a long moment. The journalist in me catalogued the tells of dishonesty, the micro-expressions, the vocal tells, the particular quality of eye contact that shifts when the speaker knows they're constructing rather than reporting. I found none of them. What I found was something that looked uncomfortably like the truth. Okay, I said. Okay. He raised an eyebrow. I believe you, I said. I reserve the right to revisit that if evidence emerges to the contrary. They almost laugh again. That's the most journalist thing you've ever said to me. I'm always a journalist, I said. I know, he said, and touched the side of my face with one hand, light, deliberate, the specific gentleness of someone who is capable of force and chooses otherwise. I like that about you. We didn't talk about the investigation again that night. In the weeks that followed, I lived in 2 stories simultaneously, which is something I'd done my entire career but never quite like this. Story 1. The investigation, which was reaching its critical phase. Webb had agreed to talk, contingent on immunity negotiations that Hayes was facilitating through a federal contact he trusted. Bloom was nervous. We'd seen enough movement in his communications to know he was aware someone was closing in, though we weren't sure how much he knew about us specifically. Anne Marsh, Theodore Marsh, who I had begun to think of as the architect of my brother's death in the way you think of a face you haven't seen but know with absolute certainty, was moving money again, which meant he was either preparing to run or preparing to act. Story 2, Colton. I had not planned to fall in love. I want to be clear about that, not as a defense but as a statement of the utter uselessness of planning where this particular feeling is concerned. I had planned seduction, performance, strategic intimacy deployed in service of an investigation. What I had not planned was to discover that the person I was strategically close to was someone I actually wanted to be close to, and that the difference between performed affection and real affection was, it turned out, everything. He was different in private in ways I was still cataloging. Quieter, for one thing, the volume he operated at publicly turned down to something that had more space in it. He read constantly, books in every genre stacked with the specificity of someone who reads because they need to, not because they should. He cooked badly and without apology and was inordinately proud of the one thing he cooked well, which was a pasta dish that he had strong opinions about and which was, in fairness, exceptional. He slept lightly, waking easily, and when he woke in the night he lay still with his eyes open in a way that I recognized as someone who was used to being alone with the weight of things. I woke one night and found him like that, and I moved across the space between us and put my head on his chest without asking, and his arm came around me in the dark, and neither of us said anything, and eventually both of us slept. That was when I knew I was in real trouble. "You're different than I thought you'd be," I told him one morning in the apartment, in the particular unguarded hour of early morning before the day's architecture goes up. "How did you think I'd be?" he asked without looking up from his coffee. "A villain," I said. He looked up at that. "And now?" I thought about what I'd told myself in his elevator that first night going down. "Do not do this, Mason." "Now," I said, "I think you might be the opposite of a villain, which is a different kind of problem." "Why a problem?" "Because I came here to destroy you," I said. "And I'm finding it increasingly difficult to maintain that particular motivation." He set the coffee down. Looked at me with the direct, stripping quality of attention that had undone me the very first time at that fundraiser across a room. "What has it shifted to?" I held his gaze. "I'm still figuring that out." His hand crossed the table and covered mine. Not dramatically, just settled over it, warm and certain. "Take your time," he said. The intimacy between us had the texture of something that had been suppressed for too long and was making up for lost time. There was urgency to it, sometimes, a quality of finally in the way of two people who are both too aware of what they want and too disciplined to reach for it quickly, so that when the discipline finally gives way the release of it is seismic. His hands on me were one of the great revelations of my adult life. Large and certain and capable of extraordinary gentleness deployed with the specificity of someone who paid attention, who noticed what drew a sound out of me, what made my breath change, what produced the specific undoing of control that I fought against and eventually lost and eventually stopped fighting. He kissed me like he was reading me, translating something, and I kissed him back like I was arguing and agreeing simultaneously, and the arguments we'd had across conference tables translated into something else entirely in the dark. We moved together slowly one night in a way that was less about urgency than about the specific luxury of having time, having chosen each other without schedule or strategy, just the lamplit apartment and the city outside and the particular silence of two people who have put down everything they carry. He held my face between his hands and looked at me like I was something he was trying to memorize, and I looked back at him and did the same, and the feeling in my chest was so large it felt briefly dangerous. Afterward, my head on his shoulder, his hand moving slow and absent in my hair, he said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." I thought for a long time. Outside, the city was doing its night breathing. Siren in the distance, wind, the low continuous sound of something always moving. When Daniel died, I said, the first thing I felt, before grief, before rage, before any of the things I was supposed to feel, was guilty. Because we'd had a fight 3 months before. About nothing. The kind of fight where you say things you don't mean and you assume there's time to take them back, and then there isn't time and you never get to take them back. Pause. I haven't told anyone that. His arm tightened around me. Not squeezing, just present. He knew, he said. You didn't know him. I knew enough, he said. He talked about you, those 2 conversations. Not a lot. But when he did it was clear. He knew. I closed my eyes. The guilty knot that had lived in my chest for 3 months loosened, not entirely, not permanently, but enough. Thank you, I said. It's the truth, he said. February. The coldest week of the year, the kind of cold that makes Chicago feel like a city at war with its own climate. Webb's immunity deal finalized. His deposition was scheduled. He was prepared to testify about the specific financial flows, the shell company structure, the names of the principals, including Theodore Marsh. 3 days before the deposition, someone broke into my apartment. I was at Colton's when it happened. I'd been spending most nights there, a fact I hadn't examined too directly. My neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Park who had appointed herself the guardian of our floor's safety, Called me at 11 p.m. to report that she'd heard sounds from my apartment and that the door had been left ajar. Colton drove. He did not let me go alone, which I initially resisted and then accepted, which was itself a statement about how much things had changed. The apartment had been searched. Not vandalized, careful, controlled, the kind of search conducted by someone who wanted you to know you'd been searched but not what they were looking for or whether they'd found it. My research files, physical copies of everything Daniel had compiled which I'd kept separate from digital backups, were gone. I stood in the middle of my apartment and felt the cold that had nothing to do with February. The digital backups are secure, Colton said behind me. I know. I turned around. They know who I am. They know I'm connected to you. Yes. His face had closed into the controlled register at war when he was managing something. Which means we've run out of time to be careful. Webb's deposition. Webb is secured. I made calls an hour ago. He crossed the room to me, stopping close, both hands on my shoulders, not romantic, practical, grounding. Listen to me. Marsh is going to move now. Not wait, not observe, move. We need to give the federal prosecutor everything tonight and get ahead of the story breaking. If we break it tonight, I don't have the full narrative. The story isn't complete. The story will never be complete if Marsh's people get to Webb before Thursday. His hands on my shoulders tightened fractionally. I know this is your story and I know what completing it means to you. But this is also your life and I am not. He stopped. Recalibrated. I need you to be safe more than I need the story to be perfect. The words landed with a weight that I sat with for a long moment. Outside, the Chicago cold pressed against the windows. I need one more piece, I said. The direct connection between Marsh and Daniel's death. I have the financial evidence, I have the email, but for this to hold, I need someone who was in the room. Someone who can testify to the order being given. Bloom, Hayes said. Bloom, I agreed. His expression said he knew I was right and didn't like what was required. Give me 2 hours, he said. What Colton did in those 2 hours I only learned afterward in parts. He called Bloom directly, not a message, not through intermediaries but his own voice, which was a move that cost him politically in ways that wouldn't be visible until later. He told Bloom that the deposition was happening Thursday and that Bloom had a choice about which side of it he was on. He told Bloom what we had. And then he made an offer that I hadn't authorized but that was correct. Partial immunity for testimony that placed Theodore Marsh in the chain of command for Daniel's death. Bloom took the deal at 1 a.m, in a conversation that lasted 45 minutes and was, by Hayes' subsequent account, one of the more unpleasant conversations of his career. He came back to my apartment. I'd stayed to begin organizing the materials for the federal prosecutor, and sat across from me at my kitchen table and looked more tired than I'd ever seen him. Bloom confirms Marsh gave the order, he said. Directly. He was in the meeting. He'll testify. I put down the folder I was holding. The acknowledgement moved through me slowly, in waves, not the single clean crest I might have expected but something more complicated, layered, the grief and the rage and the satisfaction and the strange, aching tenderness of knowing that Daniel's story would finally be complete, would finally be told correctly, would finally give him the ending he deserved. Okay, I said. My voice was steady. I had that, at least. Okay. Colton reached across the table. Took my hand. Said nothing, which was correct. There was nothing to say that the gesture didn't already say. We sat there for a while in the cold apartment, his hand over mine, the city moving outside, the story almost told. Theodore Marsh was arrested on a Thursday morning in February, at his office on the 42nd floor of a LaSalle Street tower, by federal agents executing a warrant that had been in preparation for longer than I'd known anyone was preparing it. Alderman Garrett Bloom turned himself in at federal court at 8 a.m., accompanied by his attorney. Patrick Webb's deposition, which had been the linchpin, was sealed but existed and was the basis for the indictment. My story published that same Thursday, in a joint arrangement between the Policy Review and the Chicago Tribune, because the Tribune's resources were needed for the size of what we were publishing and because, as my editor said when he called me at 6 a.m. that day with a voice that oscillated between professional pride and personal contrition, this is the biggest investigative piece out of Chicago in a decade, and you did most of it in 3 months on bereavement leave and I owe you a significant apology and a significant raise. I gave the story Daniel's byline first and mine second. The piece detailed the full architecture of the corruption network. The money, the shell companies, the aldermen, the real estate projects, the $2.3 billion in federal infrastructure grants that had been systematically drained for 8 years. It named Marsh as the architect. It named Bloom as the facilitator. It included the specific documentation of the threat to Daniel, The evidence connecting Marsh's network to the events of that October night in the Belmont parking structure, and the full email trail that Daniel had gathered in the weeks before his death. It also, in a final section that I wrote and rewrote 6 times, made explicit what Daniel had known but hadn't yet been able to prove, that Senator Colton Hayes had not been a participant in the corruption but a target of it, deliberately positioned as the story's apparent villain in order to shield the real one. I wrote that section without sentimentality and with the specific rigor that I applied to every other section, because I understood that writing it any other way would compromise it. The truth was the truth regardless of what I felt about the person it exonerated, and the truth was that Colton Hayes had spent 2 years building a case against Marsh with limited resources and considerable personal risk, and that the death of my brother had accelerated his timeline in ways that I was only beginning to fully understand. The story's publication was, there is no other word for it, seismic. I watched it from Colton's apartment, which seemed appropriate. We were both on phones from the moment publication hit, me with sources and journalists and the Tribune's legal team, him with his office and his legal counsel and what sounded like the White House. The apartment was both chaos and very calm in a way that I would remember afterward as the specific quality of something finally landing after a long fall. At some point in the early afternoon the phones went quiet. We were both on opposite sides of the room. I was at the kitchen table, he was by the window, and Chicago was doing what Chicago does when a story breaks in it, which is to say it absorbed the information and kept moving because the city is too large and too old to stop. He crossed the room, stopped in front of me. The senatorial composure was fully absent, which I now recognized as the highest form of trust he was capable of extending. It's done, he said. For now, I said. There will be trials, depositions, years of legal process. For now, he agreed. Are you all right? The question seemed to catch him off guard. People didn't ask him that very often, I suspected. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I've been carrying this for 2 years. I think I need to figure out who I am without it. That sounds like the beginning of something, I said. It does, he agreed. He looked at me the way he looked at me sometimes when he thought I wouldn't notice, with the guards down, with the full unfiltered quality of attention that he normally rationed carefully. What about you? I thought about Daniel. About the story. About the thing that I'd come here to do and had done, and the thing I hadn't expected to find on the way to doing it. I'm not done writing, I said. I know. I'm going to keep following stories that people want to go cold. That's not going to change. I know that too, he said. I wouldn't want it to. And I'm not good at, I stopped. Tried again. I don't have a very good record with personal things. I live in my head and I forget to eat dinner and I take bereavement leave and use it for investigations. I run a political operation that required building a 2-year case against a man who had someone killed, he said. I have canceled plans without notice 11 times in the last 3 months. My apartment has a coffee maker that cost $400 and I don't own a couch I actually like. I am not, as it turns out, easy. No, I agreed. But I would like to try, he said. If you want to try. I looked at him across the small distance between us. The afternoon light was doing something generous with the city outside and with the planes of his face, and the feeling in my chest was the same enormous feeling it had been that night when his arm came around me in the dark, except now it had a name, and the name was a problem I was choosing not to solve. I want to try, I said. He kissed me. Right there in the afternoon, in the apartment, without urgency, slow and certain and warm, with his hands framing my face and my hands coming up to hold his wrists, and the city outside going on being itself, enormous and indifferent and full of stories that needed telling. 8 months later. The trials were ongoing. Marsh's legal team was formidable as expected, but the evidence was sufficient and expanding, as Webb's cooperation continued to yield new documentation. Bloom had testified. 3 other city officials had been named. The investigation had, in the organic way of real investigations, grown beyond what Daniel had found and beyond what I had found and into territory that other journalists were now covering, which was the correct outcome. A story this size belonged to more than one byline. I published a book in the fall. It was about Daniel and about Chicago, and about the specific kind of courage that is required to follow a story into territory that can get you killed, and about the way grief and rage can become, in the right hands and with enough time, something that looks like justice. I dedicated it to Daniel. I thanked Colton in the acknowledgments in a single sentence that said everything I needed it to say to anyone who read it with any attention. The dedication page read, "For Daniel who started this. You were right about everything." On the day the book was published, I came home to the apartment on the West Loop. My address now, as of 3 months prior, though the formalization of that had been somewhat less ceremonial than one might expect, consisting primarily of moving boxes and an argument about whether the $400 coffee maker could coexist with my cheap stovetop espresso pot. It could, we decided, and the combination was excellent. And found Colton in the kitchen. Jacket off. Sleeves rolled. The pasta on the stove, which meant he'd left whatever Washington crisis had been occupying him early enough to be here. He heard me come in and turned around, and the expression on his face was one I now had a name for and no longer tried to set aside. "How does it feel?" he asked. I put my bag down. Crossed the kitchen. Put my arms around him from behind, my chin on his shoulder, looking at the pasta and the steam and the ordinary extraordinary fact of this. "Like something is finished," I said. "And something is beginning." His hand covered mine where it rested against his chest. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds about right." Outside, Chicago moved through its evening. The lake lit up somewhere beyond the buildings, the streets full of the particular energy of a city that carries its history in its bones and keeps going anyway, and somewhere in it, Daniel's story was part of the record now, permanent and uncollapsible, a light that was not going cold. I held on and Colton held back and the city did what cities do. It kept moving. We moved with it. Together. The book had been out for 6 hours. 6 hours of calls and emails and a launch event at a bookstore on Michigan Avenue where people asked questions about Daniel and about the investigation and about what it felt like to finish something that had started in grief, and I had answered every question honestly and with the composure I'd built over 8 months of learning that composure and honesty were not mutually exclusive, which was something Colton had taught me without meaning to. Now it was almost midnight and the apartment was quiet, and the city was doing its late-night breathing outside the windows and Colton was in the shower, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark with my jacket off and my shirt untucked and the specific bone-deep tiredness of someone who has been performing being fine for 6 hours and can finally stop. I heard the shower cut off. I heard him moving in the bathroom, the economical sounds of someone who is comfortable in a space, unhurried, at home. The light under the bathroom door went from warm yellow to off. The door opened. He came out in the dark, a towel low around his hips, and the ambient light from the city through the uncurtained window caught the water still on his shoulders, the line of his collarbone, the solid, unhurried movement of him crossing the room. He registered me sitting there, not in bed, not changed, just sitting, and he stopped. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the reading quality of attention I'd long since given up trying to deflect. Then he crossed to where I sat, stopped in front of me, and put one hand against the side of my face, palm warm from the shower, thumb tracing a slow line across my cheekbone in a gesture so unhurried it made my chest ache with the weight of being properly seen. "You did it," he said. "Quiet. Just for me." I turned my face into his palm. Pressed my lips briefly against the heel of his hand. Felt his fingers curl slightly in response. "We did it," I said. The correction made something move across his expression. Brief, ungoverned, the kind of thing his face did now that it hadn't done when I first met him, in those months when everything was controlled architecture and nothing leaked through. Now things leaked through. I took quiet, private credit for that. I reached up and pulled him down to me. He kissed me the way he kissed me when there was time, which was different from every other kind of kissing, and I had catalogued all the kinds by now with the thoroughness of someone who never stopped being a journalist even in circumstances where journalistic instinct was arguably inappropriate. There was the quick kiss of arrival and departure, functional and warm. There was the kiss of urgency, which was its own magnificent thing. And then there was this, the slow, complete, taking stock kiss that he reserved for moments when neither of us had anywhere else to be, when the night was long and the city was quiet enough and there was nothing between us and time. His mouth was warm from the shower and certain in its movement, and I kissed him back with every layer of pretense fully absent, which was the specific luxury of 8 months of choosing each other, the accumulated permission to be entirely present without managing how it looked. My hands went to his jaw, his throat, and felt the low sound he made against my mouth more than heard it. He drew back only enough to look at me properly. "Tell me what you need tonight," he said. The question. He asked it sometimes like that, direct, without ceremony, the same quality he brought to everything that mattered to him. In the beginning it had disarmed me, the frankness of it. Now it was one of my favorite things about him, on a list that was longer than I'd ever intended to compile. "You," I said. "Just, you." Slow. Something in his expression settled. The word slow did something to him. I'd learned that among many things. He preferred it slow when the choice was his, and I'd come to understand that the slowness was its own language, a deliberateness that said you are worth taking time with more clearly than words could. He reached for the buttons of my shirt. He undressed me with the patience he brought to everything he considered important, which meant my shirt came off one button at a time, and each interval between buttons involved his mouth on whatever became newly available. The line of my collarbone, the dip of my sternum, the pale plane of my chest, which he had once said he found beautiful in the direct, unembellished way he stated things that other people would circle around, and which I had responded to by looking at the ceiling and cataloging my feelings with the composed detachment of someone in serious denial. I was not in denial anymore. My hands were in his hair, dark and still slightly damp from the shower, and I had opinions about his hair that I kept mostly to myself because my opinions about his hair were frankly embarrassing. I held on and let him move at the pace he was moving, which was the pace of someone who was not going anywhere and knew it, and the knowing of it was its own specific pleasure. When the shirt was gone, he stood back and looked at me. Just looked. Without the analytical register of assessment, without anything strategic. Just with the plain, ungoverned appreciation of a man looking at something he wanted, and the look itself moved through me warm and electric. "You're staring," I said. "I know," he said unapologetically and kissed me again, deeper this time, his hands spreading wide and warm across my back, pulling me into the solid warmth of him as I stood, and the shock of his skin against mine produced the involuntary sound it always produced, and I felt him smile against my mouth at the sound. "That's not fair," I said. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said and walked me backward to the bed. We went down together, not falling, arranged with the practiced ease of people who have learned each other's geometries and preferences, who know that I favor this side and he favors that angle and that the space between us has a specific architecture that we've built over time. He settled over me with his weight distributed carefully, generously, and looked down at me in the city-lit dark of the room, and I looked up at him, and for a moment neither of us moved. This moment. I thought about it in the early days, when everything was performance and strategy and he was the target of an investigation I was willing to ruin myself to complete, and what I'd thought was that I would never have a moment like this with anyone I could actually trust, because the people you trust with your body are the people you've also trusted with the weight of who you are, and I had stopped believing I would find that. 8 months ago I'd been wrong. He lowered himself to kiss me. My mouth, my jaw, the curve of my ear, the side of my neck where the pulse runs close to the surface and where his mouth turned slow and deliberate, and I made a sound that was deeply undignified and did not care at all. His hands moved, one anchoring in my hair, one traveling the long line of my side with a patience that was half tenderness and half torment, and I arched into it with the specific helplessness of someone whose body had entirely overridden the part of the brain still attempting to maintain any semblance of composure. "Colton," his name in my mouth involuntary. "I've got you," he said against my throat. 3 words. The simplest possible arrangement of reassurance. And yet the effect of them in that voice, at that proximity, was something I was not going to describe in any publication under any circumstances. He was unhurried in a way that remade the meaning of the word. Every movement considered, every response catalogued and revisited, with the thorough attention of someone who treated this the way he treated everything that mattered to him, as something deserving of his full presence, full effort, full investment. I had understood early on that Colton Hayes did not do anything halfway, and I was now on the receiving end of that quality in a context that made the professional applications of it seem, in retrospect, quite modest. His mouth traced the line of my chest, my stomach, the sharp jut of my hip, and my hands fisted in the sheets because the alternative was grabbing him and hurrying him, and he would not be hurried, and part of me, the embarrassingly large part, was deeply grateful for that. When he finally moved where I wanted him, the sound I made was swallowed by his mouth over mine, and his hand was warm and certain and working with the confidence of someone who knew precisely what he was doing and had no interest in pretending otherwise. "You're not breathing," he observed against my jaw. "I'm fully aware," I managed. The low sound he made was gratifyingly close to a laugh. When we came together it was with the specific quality of the slow he'd promised, a long, close gathering, and the stretch and settle of it drew a sound from me that was embarrassingly close to his name, repeated, and his forehead dropped to mine, and for a moment we were simply still, adjusting to the full present fact of each other. He moved. And the movement was exactly what he'd said, slow and deep, and with the full attention of someone who was entirely here, entirely in this, entirely with me. I had my arms around him, holding the broad plane of his back, feeling the controlled shift and flex of him moving above me, and I pressed my face to his neck and breathed him in, the clean warm smell of him, post-shower and present and real, one of the most reliable anchors I had found in the last year of a life that had included considerable turbulence. "Look at me," he said low. I pulled back enough to look at him. His expression in the dark was open in the way it only ever was with me, stripped of every layer he wore in every other room of his life, and what was underneath the layers was a man who was very much in love and not currently in any condition to conceal it, and I held that look with everything I had. His length moved within me with a rhythm that was gradually, inevitably becoming less slow, his breath picking up against my skin, and my own breathing had long since left the range of anything I could call controlled. "Mason," he said. Just my name, in the voice that always made the temperature of the room change. "I know," I said. "I know. I'm here." The city outside was doing what it always did, moving, breathing, going on, and in the amber half-dark of the room we moved together with the language we'd built between us over 8 months of choosing each other, and the feeling that had been living in my chest since that night in his office when I first sat too close and refused to acknowledge what the proximity meant was no longer caged and no longer denied and no longer managed. It was simply present, enormous and undeniable, the realest thing in the room. When it crested, it was together, the specific exquisite simultaneity that is never guaranteed and always astonishing when it arrives, and his voice was low against my ear saying something that I would hold in the private archive of things that belong only to me, and my hands were pressed flat against his back as if without the pressure of it I might come apart entirely. We lay tangled afterward in the dark, breathing slowly back to normal. His hand was moving in my hair again. He did this always, after this slow absent movement, and I had learned not to comment on how much I liked it because the expression on his face when I commented on it was one of the most disarming things I'd ever seen and I could only handle it in limited doses. "Tell me something," he said eventually. "A ritual." His voice was low and entirely undone, which was my favorite register of him. I stared at the ceiling. The city cast its amber light across it. "I think Daniel would have liked you," I said. "Once he figured out you weren't the villain." Which would have taken him about 2 conversations, and then he would have liked you immediately and aggressively and he would have had opinions about your policy positions that he would have shared at volume. Colton's chest moved under me, the laugh, the real one, the quiet one that I had worked for weeks to first produce and now received regularly. "I think I would have liked him too," he said. "Yeah," I said. "I think so." His hand continued its slow movement. The city moved outside. The night was long and the apartment was warm and I was exactly where I was, held and holding, with the full weight of the year behind me and something good, something genuinely and unexpectedly good, in front of me. "Hey," I said. "Thank you for letting me in," I said. "Even when you knew why I was there. Even when it was complicated and risky and I was looking for reasons to make you the villain." He was quiet for a moment. The hand in my hair stilled, then resumed. "Thank you for staying," he said, "when you found out I wasn't." I pressed my lips to his shoulder. Felt him exhale, long and slow and like something put down. Outside, Chicago went on being itself, ancient and relentless and full of stories, beautiful and corrupt and capable of redemption in the specific way of cities that have seen everything and are still standing. My brother was part of its story now, permanent and uncollapsible, filed in the record of the true things. And I was here. In the dark. Warm and held and no longer the person who came into this looking to burn it down, but someone else. Someone who had found, in the ruins of what he came to destroy, something worth building. I closed my eyes. Colton's heartbeat was steady under my palm. I slept.